Let's look at some of the other controls and processes used for mixing. At the bottom of each console strip, we have the controls for basic mixing control. A full mixing tutorial is beyond the scope of this video, so we'll just look at the basics. Pan is used to control where in the stereo field the track is positioned, from left to right. It's common practice to have drums, bass and vocals sit fairly central in the mix, and other instruments placed towards the sides but in a balanced way. You wouldn't have all other instruments panned to one side, for example, as that would sound very unusual. Level is obvious, and when mixing it's best to start with levels fairly low. You can always turn something up when it is low to start with, but when it starts at high level and you need to turn it up, there's nowhere left to go. It's very easy to start making everything louder until the whole mix becomes a mess. It's much better to use EQ and compression to fit instruments into a mix, rather than just level alone. Most of these controls have a last setting memory. For example, if I move the fader down and then right-click over it, there is a revert to 0 dB, and selecting that resets the fader there. Right-click again, and the revert now reads -12 dB. Double-click a control to return it to its default snap to value. That value can be set by adjusting the control to the desired position, and then right-clicking over the control and selecting Value Set Snap to equals current from the menu. This then becomes the point that the control will snap to when you double-click on it. The mute and solo buttons are used to isolate instruments or remove them from the mix, so that you can hear the mix with or without instruments, or listen to instruments in isolation. It's not generally a good idea to mix an instrument in isolation, because what sounds good soloed may not necessarily sound good in the mix, and vice versa. The interleave button changes the way audio is played back regardless of the actual material on the track, either mono or stereo. The phase button is used to invert the waveform and can help fix phasing problems if a track is out of phase. The read and write buttons relate to automation, and we'll be looking at that later. We've already seen quick grouping in use, but it's also possible to create permanent control groups. This can come in handy for checking mixes by grouping mute or solo buttons together, or grouping faders. A drum kit, for example, might have 8 or 9 tracks, and once they're mixed as a drum kit, it's much easier to move all faders together should the kit need adjustment. To create a group, select all the tracks you want to include, and then right-click over the control you want to group and select Group New from the menu. You can name the group and then click on OK. Once controls are grouped, moving one will also move the other. To adjust one control in the group without changing the others, just hold down the control key as you move the control. Further controls can be added by right-clicking on them and selecting the group to add to from the menu. Any control can be added, it doesn't have to be the same type. You might want to pan an instrument to a particular side as a volume is increased, for example. It's possible to set up some quite complex grouping using the Group Manager selected from the right-click menu. For example, if I select one of the faders in this group and then swap the start and end values, then clear the Preserve Mix Between Game Members option, once that is applied, moving one control down moves the other up and vice versa. Controls can be constrained in relation to each other by adjusting the start and end figures. To remove a control from a group, right-click over it and select Remove from Group, or clear the whole group by selecting that option. Now let's take a look at the channel EQ. As I mentioned earlier, an EQ is a processor as it affects the whole signal. It wouldn't make much sense to mix dry signal with the processed version. It would defeat the object of applying EQ in the first place. It is found toward the top of the channel strip. It's turned on and off with a button, and the interface can be controlled by click-dragging on the plot display just beneath it. However, it's probably easier to work with it by opening the main interface, which is opened by double-clicking the plot region. This EQ can be thought of as a collection of 6 volume controls that work on a range of frequencies known as a band. These bands are adjustable for both width and their frequency center points, as well as the shape of the band by changing the filter type. Let's take a look. Center top is a larger plot display so that we can see the shape of the EQ curve being applied. The low or bass frequencies are on the left, and the high or treble frequencies on the right. The centre band is the zero level point where gain is neither being boosted or cut, and the flat white line indicates that. The bands can be turned on or off by double-clicking on the node in the plot window or using the band on-off in the control area beneath. The type of filter for each band can be selected by clicking on the arrow to the right of the filter button, or cycle through by clicking on it. Filter 1, for example, is typically used as a high-pass filter. As the name suggests, it only lets frequencies higher than the corner frequency through. The Q setting adjusts how steep the curve is, and you can see that as I adjust it. This cuts frequencies that might otherwise muddy a mix-up, and even on a kick drum, setting this at around 40 Hz won't change the character of the kick too much. Click drag up or down to adjust the parameter in the main interface. A low-pass filter is the exact opposite of the high-pass and only allows frequencies beneath the set frequency through. This can be used on a bass instrument, for example, where little energy exists in the top end. The secret to learning to use EQ is to use your ears and hear the changes that moving the controls make. We'll look at one technique for setting up EQ shortly, but first let's take a quick look at the other filter types and controls. The peak dip type is sometimes referred to as a bell filter because of the shape it creates on the plot line. You'll see that as I boost and cut the gain. Without getting into a complex explanation, a basic description of Q is that it controls the width of the filter type, or how many frequencies are affected by a filter. The lower the Q number, the wider the band. If I boost this bell filter and then increase the Q, you'll see the bandwidth narrow until at its extreme it's a very narrow peak. Shelf type are typically used at the low or higher ends of the frequency range and basically boost or cut everything above the frequency if it's a high shelf, or below the set frequency if it's a low shelf. How steep the initial curve is controlled by the Q setting. Now we've seen the controls, let's look at a technique that can help set up EQ on a track. Remember that every instrument is different, and even the same instrument in different mixes will need EQing differently depending on many variables, such as the style of music, the number of tracks in the mix, and how well the instrument was EQ'd and recorded in the first place. Initially, solo the track and start playback over a loop section. Next, set one of the bands to peak type with a high gain setting. Increase Q until there is a relatively narrow band. I tend to use band 1 for convenience. Now sweep the frequency range and listen out for the areas where the track sounds both better and worse. As you find these regions, highlight the frequency and cut and paste it to the next unused filter's frequency setting. You'll probably find a couple of areas where it sounds good, as well as a couple where it doesn't sound too great. As well as these areas, change band 1 to a high pass filter and then adjust the frequency from low to high until you can hear a change in the sound, and then reduce the frequency very slightly. Once that's done, we have areas that sound good that can be boosted slightly, and those that don't sound so great that can be cut, but always within the context of a mix. As I said earlier, a good sounding solo instrument doesn't necessarily sound good in a mix, and what sounds great in a mix may well sound pretty awful soloed. You'll also need to make space in a mix for all instruments. For example, in a typical band mix, the kick drum and bass guitar tend to compete in the same frequency range. But applying a high pass filter on a bass guitar around 70 to 80 Hz and perhaps boosting a little around the 600 Hz mark will leave space at the very bottom end for the kick drum. Remember, however, that every mix is different. Learn to trust your ears. What sounds good usually is good, regardless of the settings it took to get there. Beneath the EQ is the effects bin. This works in exactly the same way as it does on a bus, and effects can be added by either right-clicking over it and choosing the required effect from the menu, or using the effects browser to drag and drop the effect in. Once the effect is inserted, its interface will automatically open. If closed, double-click on the effect's name to show it again. As I mentioned earlier, if using an effect, use its mix knob to control the amount of effect added, or put the effect on a bus and use a send to control how much effect is added. The send module we've already seen earlier. Note that once a send has been inserted though, the destination output can be changed from the output drop-down. We saw the manual method of inserting a bus earlier, but there is also an Insert Send Assistant. This opens a dialog where the destination can be chosen or a new bus created. It's also possible to create a new bus and insert effects at the time of creation. There's also an option here to set the send as pre-fader. There's also a button on the send module to make the send either pre or post fader later. You may be wondering what the difference is. By default, the send is post fader. This means that if you reduce the track's volume fader, the level sent to the bus is automatically reduced as well. If the send is pre-fader, the track volume fader has no effect on the send level at all. So why use one over the other, you might be asking? Let's think about post-fader first. In the scenario we looked at earlier with the reverb send, we need it to be post-fader. If it wasn't, every time we change the volume of the track, we'd have to adjust the level of the reverb send to maintain the correct balance between dry and wet sound. The post setting automatically decreases or increases the send level as the fader is moved up and down. It's easy to demonstrate the difference. You can see the level on the reverb meter dropping as I decrease the volume fader and rising again as I increase it. If I change the send to pre-fader and repeat that, you'll notice that the reverb meter doesn't change as the levels going to the bus are now unaffected by the track fader movements. If that's the case, you might wonder why we ever need pre-fader sends. One scenario where we wouldn't want the fader to affect the send level is if we were setting up a headphone mix. In that case, we'd have a bus called headphone mix that outputs to a headphone amp with a send to it inserted on each track. Once we've set up a good mix for the headphones, we wouldn't want it upset every time a volume fader is changed. To stop that happening, the headphone send is changed to pre-fader, so any volume adjustments on the track don't affect the levels going to that bus.